And let's talk about the autumn jewels and why the leaves change color in the fall. Okay, let's see if we can get this guy to work. Okay, now when I first started doing this presentation, my friend Bev Donaldson came across this cartoon in the newspaper, a Sunday newspaper, and sent me this because I thought it was pretty interesting. This is not what happens. Mother Nature does not have a magic bazooka and blast them with, her magic bazooka to change their color. We've understood for a long time how this process works, but we have not understood so much why. And the thing about Mother Nature is she does nothing profligately. She does everything beautifully, but there is a purpose and a function behind everything she does, often multiple functions and multiple positive outcomes. So let's talk about what's going on. So as I said, we know how they do it. And what we're talking about here is, chlorophyll. That is the product of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process through which plants take carbon dioxide, which is a waste for us, a waste product for us. We exhale carbon dioxide and sunlight. And through the process of photosynthesis, generate chlorophyll, which is a naturally occurring dye that has makes leaves look green. It's basically a starch, and it's the building blocks of life in many ways. Plants are the only organisms on the planet that make their own food, and they do this through photosynthesis, and that food is chlorophyll. As the days get shorter and colder, and this is particularly shorter, this is a process that is linked to day length. The shortening day length as fall, late summer and fall begin. What happens is the trees and shrubs and other woody plants absorb the chlorophyll in the leaves back into the plant's woody structures to store it, retain it, so that it's available for the plant to utilize the next spring as it begins its annual cycle once again. As that chlorophyll is leached from the leaves and drawn into the woody tissue of the plant, other chemicals are revealed. Now, these chemicals may have been present all along, but masked by the presence of the chlorophyll, and also at the same time masked and also their concentration reduced, or they may only be expressed at this time of year. So how this process works is, if you look at it, this is a cross section of a sugar maple leaf. I love that because it's one of our iconic trees here in Michigan, and actually through a lot of the region that we belong to that's known for good fall color. There are only 3 regions in the world known for really beautiful fall color, and we are in one of them. We're in the same region as Vermont. Vermont just has better publicity about it. So what you have, this is the upper epidermis layer. Also, sometimes we call this the very top, the cuticle. It's kind of a waxy surface to the leaf that the leaf creates or as it matures, which helps protect it from sun damage and from insect damage to some extent. So you have the upper epidermis layer with the cuticle at the top, and then you have the palisade cells. And these are the cells in which the photosynthesis is actually occurring. And you have a couple of layers of them, and they're on the upper face of the leaf because that is the face that is, facing the sun, okay? As the leaves turn, that green chlorophyll is drawn back through the vascular system, the veins in the leaf. Plants aren't that different from us, really. They have a vascular system. They have hormones. They have a lot of the same dynamics. They have turgor pressure. We have blood pressure. So lots of similar functions, okay? So the leaves, the veins of the leaves are the vascular system through which that chlorophyll is drawn back into the woody tissue of the plant. Trees and shrubs have, they have sort of like a vein and artery system. You have phloem and xylem. Phloem is the part of the vascular system that's going down from the canopy into the root system. Think phloem, although it's spelled with a PHL, not an FL. So that's what that's doing is taking the food up that's being produced through photosynthesis in the canopy and taking it down through the tree to nourish the roots, where the roots are drawing up nutrients from the soil and water, and through the xylem part of the vascular system, is drawing that up through the tree. And then the leaves actually will release moisture through a process called transpiration through the stomata, which are tiny, tiny little openings in the leaves, which is why it can be much, much cooler under a tree than it is out in the hot sun in the summertime. So what happens is that there are two basic classifications of chemicals that are being expressed at this time. The anthocyanins, which help give us our red and purple pigments, and the carotenoids, which give us the yellow to orange pigments. And these fill the cells that have been vacated by the chlorophyll. It is the mixture of these two chemical classes that determines the expression of purple, red, orange, or yellow for the tint of the leaf as time passes, as the color changes. So that's how it happens. That's the process that's going on. In terms of why, you know, it's not all about making something beautiful, although it is beautiful. It may be that the anthocyanins are shielding the changing leaves from sun damage as they send those nutrients into the plant's woody tissue. The two most vulnerable times in a woody plant's annual cycle is in the spring, when the leaves are expanding, and in the fall, when the chlorophyll is retreating into the woody tissues of the plant. This is when the leaves are most vulnerable. In the spring, the leaves are expanding. As they're expanding, they don't have the cuticle. They're not fully developed. They haven't formed the cuticle to protect themselves. And oftentimes, you will see the plants that have reddish leaves in the fall also have a reddish cast to the juvenile foliage in the spring, expressed until that chlorophyll production really starts going. And you may also see this in the petiole, which is the leaf stem. Even during the height of the season, in the middle of summer, that leaf stem may still have a hint of red to it. So these are things to look for in these plants. Note a plant that goes red in the fall. Look at the foliage in the spring. Look at the stems of the leaves in the summer. You may notice that there is this consistency, that this red is there. The relative presence of anthocyanins may also be reflected in flower color. This is the case, for example, with Cercis canadensis, or redbud, which the leaves go yellow, but the flowers are quite beautifully, almost like a fuchsia pink, except in the alba, the naturally occurring white form of that plant, white flowering form. We don't know if the carotenoids have a role in this scenario. Probably the best known carotenoid is beta carotene, which we find in our carrots. So think about, you know, that's a way to remember the orange is the carotenoids. Another process that's going on is that both of these chemical classifications in high enough concentrations are toxic to some insects. Now, this phrase, in high enough concentrations, is very important because, as I said, these chemicals may be available in the leaf tissue during the height of the season, but they are essentially, in a sense, overwhelmed by the presence of the chlorophyll. So their presence is minimal in comparison to the presence of the chlorophyll. It's actually important that those chemicals are there even in the height of summer, because a lot of the caterpillars who are feeding on these foliar tissues, the leaf tissues, okay, and the caterpillars are really important. Caterpillars are converting that foliar tissue into available protein for other organisms to feed on, especially, for example, our native songbirds, particularly our neotropical migrants, most of our native songbirds are actually feeding their babies, regardless as to what the adults are eating, whether they're eating seeds or fruit or insects or nuts or nectaring. They're feeding their babies insects, primarily caterpillars, because caterpillars are really easy to digest. And if you've ever watched a parent bird feeding its babies, it's not a delicate process. It's kind of like plunging your really backed up toilet. But caterpillars are pretty soft-bodied, and they have more protein and key nutrients than the equivalent amount of ground beef. And those carotenoids and anthocyanins that they contain from eating that leaf tissue is critical to, in some species, plumage color. This is especially the case, for example, with cardinals, for example. Okay, so those chemicals may still be there in the height of summer, but the chlorophyll is the dominant presence, and so we don't really see the carotenoids or the anthocyanins being expressed. The thing about toxicity is the toxicity is higher in the spring when the leaves are not even yet mature, and in the fall when the chlorophyll is retreating into the woody tissues of the plant. During these vulnerable times, that's when that high level of toxicity is occurring to protect the leaves from consumption at those points in the season. The thing about toxicity is a relative term. It's not an absolute term. I don't need to kill you to get you to stop doing something. That's really not a good plan. The idea is I'm going to give you a bad experience. I'm going to make you sick. I'm going to give you a bad reaction of some kind. And that's what I need to do. And you'll stop doing it. And most species will do that. There seem to be exceptions. And so that's the idea. Is I don't need to kill you to get you to stop necessarily. I just need to get you to stop by giving you a bad experience. So basically we're talking about chemical warfare, keeping off predators at a critical time in the season. There's some other examples of this. There's allelopathy, which is a situation where one plant harms other plants with specific biomolecules. Probably the best example of that in our environment here in Michigan is the black walnut, Juglans nigra. Hang on a second, thank you. Just give me a minute here. I can hear my voice getting rusty. The roots of this plant contain a toxin called juglone, and a lot of plants are very sensitive to this, and especially, for example, plants in the tomato family, the Solanacea family. There are plants that can cope with this chemical, but it does help to limit competition, improving the individual plant's chances at success, and not just the individual plant, but its offspring, because those nuts that it's dropping, it helps limit competition for its offspring as those nuts germinate and create more black walnuts. There are other examples. There's some interesting examples. I think there's an exotic plant, the honeybees like it. It's a Centaurea species. Spotted knapweed has an allelopathic characteristic, which is very troubling. It's an exotic invasive plant, and part of the reason for its great success here is not just that there's nothing that feeds on it here, but it has this allelopathic characteristic that helps limit competition, and a lot of the native plants aren't adapted to handle the toxin that it's releasing into the soil. Another example of chemical warfare is aposematism. This is where an organism, advertises its unpalatable or poisonous nature either through distinctive coloration or sound. This is more characteristic we see in faunal species. For example, I talked about giving someone a bad experience. So monarch butterflies consume toxins that are contained in milkweed species, making them not so much unpalatable to predators in a sense. The milkweeds contain, all plants contain alkaloids, and the alkaloids are generated, and their chemical signatures vary from species to species, from genus to genus. The plants in the same genus typically have similar, if not identical, alkaloid profiles. And what's happened is that with these alkaloids, they make it difficult for all insects to utilize them. And so insects have specialized to feed on certain plants or certain ranges of plants. There are some insect species, for example, that are generalists, but a lot of them are more specific, and monarchs are a good example of this. The cardiac glycoside that milkweed species contain can, in sufficient quantity, cause heart problems, but that's not its primary function in this dynamic of aposematism, because that would be an experience that would be difficult to associate with consuming something that had eaten this substance. What it does in terms of smaller amounts of consumption, saying a blue jay who's eaten a monarch butterfly is it causes a violent vomiting response. Now, the key thing here, when I said something about being unpalatable, most birds do not have particularly strong senses of smell and taste. They don't have receptors for a lot of the things out there in terms of smell and taste. For example, they don't have receptors for capsaicin. This is what makes hot peppers hot. Mammals do, birds don't. This is why birds can eat hot peppers with impunity. They can't taste that substance. They might not be able to taste the cardiac glycoside. It would be really nasty tasting. But this will make them throw up. And by throwing up quite violently, very shortly after consuming something that's orange and black, you're not going to want to eat something orange and black again. And interestingly, in the case of this example, many, if not all, of the organisms that utilize milkweeds, from milkweed bugs and milkweed beetles to monarch butterflies and milkweed tussock moths, for example, at some point in their life cycles, they display a combination of orange and black coloring. So this is their way of, flashing and going, you really don't want to eat me because you're going to have a really bad experience. Some South American butterfly species use the same technique, although their coloration is a brilliant blue. Keep in mind that our visual field is pretty narrow. If we use the entire piano keyboard to indicate the entire visual field, insects can see pretty much that whole visual field, whereas our portion that we see is about 1 octave of that. Insects can see infrared and ultraviolet light, and other organisms see different ranges on that keyboard. Okay. Another example is mimicry. So I'm going to look like something that isn't good to eat. So the viceroy butterfly, which does not consume the same toxin, mimics the monarch's coloring, advertising that it also causes an adverse reaction. Viceroys host on native willow species, which also contain a toxin. It's not the same toxin, but this is sort of hopping on the whole monarch thing and going, you don't want to eat me because I'm going to cause something bad too. And again, we also see the similar phenomenon in South American butterflies, that species that are not related to the morpho blues, for example, have blue coloring to advertise the fact that they too aren't good to eat. Not all of our native plants are characterized by brilliant fall color. American sycamore, or Platanus occidentalis, doesn't get really beautifully colored, probably by most people's standards. Populus deltoides, or eastern cottonwood, similarly gets kind of yellow, but also gets kind of these charcoaly gray spots on the leaves as they age. Quercus bicolor, compared to a lot of our other oak species, color is kind of paper bag brown. It might get some reddish brown going, but not for very long. It's not nearly as brilliant as some of its relatives. So we're going to start this is going to be our scrapbook, our picture book of native plants in summer and fall wardrobes. Okay. Okay, here we go. So this is, we have quite a few maples that are native to Michigan. We're going to look at the 3 best known. Acer rubrum, which is the red maple, and you can see where it gets its name from in the lower right picture. You can see, I like these images because you can start to see the beginnings of the chlorophyll retreating from the leaf, the foliar tissue, into the woody parts of the tree and progressing, and then you have this brilliant red expression. Acer saccharum, silver maple, also brilliantly colored. There are some of these that seem to go yellow and some that go more red. Excuse me. This is a tree that's pretty maligned because it doesn't do very well in the urban setting. Keep in mind, there's no such thing as a naturally occurring urban tree. No plant evolved to conform to human urban existence. So when we have a tree that doesn't work well with that, that's not the tree's fault. The tree evolved in a certain context, and its behavior reflects that evolution, and it can only do that. It can't adapt to what we've done in the last 300, 400 years, maybe if that long. That's the blink of it, not even the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. Silver maples are what I call self-cleaning trees. What this means is when they're done with a part of themselves, whether it's a seed, a samara, a little helicopter thing, or a leaf or a twig or a 2-ton limb, it drops it. In an urban setting, oftentimes it's dropping it on a street or a driveway or a car or a house or a garage. It's not the tree's fault. It's the fault of the human beings who have either planted it inappropriately or have tolerated it when it has volunteered somewhere. I used to kind of take against this tree until I saw a beautiful specimen in the midst of an open space at the Edsel and Eleanor Ford Estate over in Grosse Pointe Shores. And it's a beautiful tree. It's a beautiful tree. It was utilized by the First Nations for sugar. The silver maple, the concentration of sugar in the sap is not as great as it is in the sugar maple. So you have to tap a lot more of it, but you can cook it down into a very good maple syrup. I like to say syrup. Speaking of which, the sugar maple, this is the sugar maple, which goes more orange, yellow to orange in the fall. This is a tree that's across the street from me at my house that is in decline because it's experienced a lot of trauma at the hands of bad traffic, even though we're on a residential streets and horrible things have happened to this tree. It's not helped by the fact that these trees don't like hot summers. So what we're going to see happen with these, along with our paper birches, is their range is going to continue to retreat north with climate change. They don't like salt. I'm grateful that we don't salt our roads here in my neighborhood because salt is really, really bad for a lot of plants, and it's bad for our infrastructure. That's why we have such bad roads. If you look at the underpasses, as you're driving by, all that breakdown in the cement is because of the salt that we use. Salt is cheap up front here in Detroit because we live on a salt mine, but the long-term expense is very, very high in terms of what it does to everything else in the environment because salt is a corrosive. Aesculus glaber, or Ohio buckeye, not a plant that a lot of people like because it seems messy to them. If you want to get on my last nerve, talk to me about messy trees and destructive animals. Nothing that any other organism generates is anything but biodegradable. So, all of this, the leaves are compound leaves. You can see there are 5 leaflets. This is the whole leaf right here. So each of these is a leaflet, okay? And this is the petiole for the leaf, okay? And it drops a lot of leaves and leaflets and such. It has these wonderful nuts that are very attractive to the wildlife, which for me is a real bonus. I garden. My gardening strategy is to generate permaculture for the faunal species, and that's how I see it as beautiful. Betula papyrifera, this is paper birch. There are a number of other birches native to Michigan. The river birch is not native. It is native south of here. It's what we sometimes call a near native. It does not seem to express any invasiveness. Birches and the poplars and aspens, these are what we call pioneer species. And what that means is these are the trees that are the first to come into a prairie context, coming in from the edges, and they are fast growing and short-lived. And what happens is they come in and they grow up pretty fast, and they provide shade and shelter for the saplings of the longer-lived hardwoods, the maples, the beeches, and the oaks. And by the time those saplings are big enough to handle everything on their own, that's when the poplars, aspens, and birches go into decline and eventually crumble and then add their nutrients back into the soil to nourish the new succession of the hardwood trees. I love the birches because, regardless as to what species, you can bog birch, yellow birch, paper birch, and the river birch as well. You have these beautiful bark on the mature wood, on the trunk and the limbs, but the twigs, as you can see, are quite dark, which sets up a very nice contrast, especially in the winter with the paper birch. As I said, with silver maple, paper birch does not do well in the south part of its range. It's it's getting too warm now. The bronze birch borer, which is a native relative of the emerald ash borer, is a major issue with the paper birches. And as climate change continues, its range where it's able to, where the bronze birch borer gets frozen out is going to continue to climb further north. So we'll see fewer and fewer paper birches, mature paper birches in the southern part of its range. Carya ovata, shagbark hickory. There are at least 3 hickory species native to Michigan. There's the shagbark, the shellbark, and the pignut. You're not going to find too many of these at the nursery because they're very difficult to pot grow. And you're not going to want to have them produced through a ball and burlap process. I do know that the nursery that I go to in Mason, I think he grows the pignut hickory. These also are compound leaves, but you can see that the leaflets are arranged differently. This stem, the leaf stem, we call it the rachis. It's like the same term that we use for the central spine of a feather. So these leaves are not arrayed in a circle, but they're on a long stem, and the leaflets are arranged on either side. In this case, you have what's called a pinnate leaf. Oh, sorry. So you have a single stem, the rachis, and then the leaves are arranged on either side with a terminal leaflet at the bottom. So this whole thing is the leaf. And these leaflets are pretty good sized. So the buds on these trees, on the hickories, are really big in the late spring before the leaves emerge. And that's one way to identify them. Also, the distinctive bark of the shagbark and shellbark hickories. Like the Ohio buckeye and like our walnut trees, these trees are not real tidy, and they drop a lot of material, leaflets and whole leaves. They also have fruit. Pecans are actually a type of hickory, further south range. But the nuts are really good for the wildlife as well. Because they're difficult to grow in pots, I was talking to Bill. He's the guy who owns the nursery in Mason. This is my cat, Pericles. Someone always has to do a cameo when I do these things at home. And I asked him about, how do you grow a hickory? And he says, well, go get some, harvest some nuts from the tree that you want to grow, fresh nuts, and bury a half a dozen of them where you want a hickory tree, and pray over it to whatever deity you prefer. You might want to put a little hardware cloth over it to make sure the squirrels don't adventitiously discover your cache, and hope. Why would you want to grow a hickory? Because they, being the hardwoods that they are carbon sinks. They store a significant amount of carbon for the tissue that they generate. So lots of advantages to a hickory. Fraxinus pennsylvanica, or green ash. This was my green ash in my tree lawn until 2007. So 15 years ago. Again, a compound leaf. Here's the rachis. These are the leaflets. They are arranged opposite to one another, and a terminal leaflet at the end. Our ashes, of course, have been hit by the emerald ash borer that came in probably in packing material to DTW down in Romulus. I really like these trees. This green ash goes this beautiful buttery yellow, probably about very similar to the yellow that the eastern redbud goes in the fall. The other thing about these trees, the ashes, native ashes, that's really important, is that they are host plants for the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly. The butterfly also hosts on tulip tree and our native cherries. So things like wild cherry, black cherry, choke cherry, and American plum. The cherry species actually host over 400 species of Lepidoptera. The tulip tree is not a heavy lifter where it comes to faunal support. So if you have to choose between a cherry species and a tulip tree in terms of ecosystem services, I would go with the cherry. Gladitsia triacanthus is honey locust. This is actually in the pea family. And here is another example of a compound leaf structure. So if we look here, this is the entire leaf right here. This is the rachis. This is a bipinnate leaf. You have this axis here, and then you have these subaxes coming off, and there are the leaflets. But this whole structure here is the leaf. So pinnate would be the single rachis with the leaflets arranged. Bipinnate means you have these subrachii coming off the edge, off of it to either side. This is a plant that is dioecious. You have male and female, and the females produce these really cool kind of contorted seed pods with really actually rather small seeds. It's in the pea family. It looks a lot like a big, huge contorted pea pod. And they make a really great combination if you have a nice pottery or wooden bowl, put them in a wooden bowl with some seed pods from the sweet gum or Liquidambar styraciflua, which is not native to Michigan, but we see a lot of them around here. They have great fall color. They're the ones that look like, they're like Mother Nature's Legos. Look like all these little baby bird beaks poking out. You step on them and you get mad, but they're all biodegradable. Okay, here's another cameo. This is Dora. Dora, come here. She always comes when I do these. This is my sweetheart. Ginocladus dioicus, Kentucky coffee tree. You can see from the epithet here. So when you talk about botanical Latin, this here part, the first part is the genus, tells you which genus the plant belongs to. The second part of the name is the epithet, tells you which member of the genus you were talking about. This epithet tells us that this plant is dioecious, which, like Gleditsia triacanthos or honey locust, means that you have male and female plants. And if you don't have both in proximity, these are insect pollinated, you're not going to get fruit, okay? There are a number of these over at Elmwood Cemetery. I sometimes lead tours there. This is just a part of the leaf. Kentucky coffee tree has the largest leaf of any tree in North America. It can be up to 4 feet long. It is bipinnate. This is the central rachis here. And you have the rachis coming off with the leaflets, okay? This is a tree that I can recognize very easily just driving by it in the winter, because with these big leaves, when the leaves drop, the tree almost looks like it's been pollarded, sort of pruned back. This is an old coppicing process that very ancient process that we've used to work with trees in cultivation. The seed pod in this case is a very short, stout, fat seed pod. I actually have some in my living room. I should have brought them in here to show you. And the seed is pretty good sized, and it was actually ground up and used as a coffee substitute by the early Americans, colonists. Let's make that clear. Juglans cinerea, we mentioned black walnut. This is its relative, butternut. You don't see a lot of these trees. They tend to get blight. This is a tree that I used to work around in a garden in Grosse Pointe Farms. Also compound leaves. These are pinnate leaves. So you have the leaves are arranged opposite along the rachis, and then you have a terminal leaf, much like the ash. This is another tree that drops a lot of material, stems, leaflets, nuts. In the garden where this tree is found, I took many years ago, it was a beautiful picture of the base of the trunk. This could be, I'm wondering, I don't know that it's still alive. It might have been a Michigan champion tree if we'd ever bothered to measure it, because it was quite huge at 4 feet high. That's where we measure to determine the girth of a tree. And in the tree nearby, I don't know if it was on the same property. I think it was in the adjacent property, but the two canopies intermingled was a pin oak, and there was a red squirrel, not a fox squirrel, the little red squirrels, the really aggressive squirrels, who lived up in these trees. And I don't think that squirrel ever had to touch ground. I think he cached all of his food up in the canopy, and it was a case of whether he felt like having butternuts or acorns for dinner that day. And he would pelt stuff at me, and he had very good aim. Larix laricinus, tamarack. This is a deciduous conifer, the only deciduous conifer in Michigan. Very soft needles, native to wet conditions, high moist content. My friend up in Mason has a couple of these on her property. There is a beautiful stand of them near Ortonville as you're driving from 75 toward Ortonville. The needles go this beautiful gold before they drop. Not often seen in cultivation. I think this is an underutilized plant. It's certainly unique in this ecosystem. I mentioned tulip tree or yellow poplar. This is Liriodendron tulipifera is the botanical Latin name. It is actually a magnolia. And if you were to see the flowers and the carpel, the resulting seed fruiting body, you would immediately recognize it as a magnolia. It's called tulip tree because the leaves kind of look like a tulip. And the flower, although it's definitely a magnolia, sort of looks a bit like a tulip as well. It's kind of a slightly chartreuse yellow with orange throat. Usually borne high up in the canopy, not easy to see oftentimes, although sometimes you can get lucky and find a tree that's got some flowers lower down. Platanus occidentalis, American sycamore. A lot of people don't like this tree because it generates a lot of material. It has exfoliating bark, like the shagbark and shellbark hickories. It also is subject to a condition called anthracnose. Now, anthracnose is a condition, it's basically a series of symptoms that occurs in different species and different genera. It's caused by different pathogens, depending on which genus we're talking about. So it's a fungal disorder. The fungus that causes the symptoms in American sycamore is not the same fungus as causes it in, for example, flowering or pagoda dogwood. In the case of American sycamore, it causes the tree to defoliate and then it leaves out again. It is, even if it goes systemic, it's not fatal. It's considered an aesthetic condition. So don't worry about it, okay? Rake the leaves up and put them in your beds or something. The great thing about sycamores, I love them. There's some beautiful old sycamores at Elmwood as well, near the, I think it's near the Fireman's Cemetery. I don't get out that far very often, but they're beautiful. They're like big, huge ghosts because they're just white. The way you can tell the difference between an American sycamore and the London plane tree that's used a lot in urban forestry is the American sycamores are really, really white, whereas the London plane tree, that's Platanus ox acerifolia. It's called a London plane tree because it was a spontaneous hybrid that occurred in Kew Gardens in London between the American sycamore and the Chinese sycamore. So hence London plane tree. They call sycamores plane trees in England. The London plane tree has a more greenish yellow bark. And I think the American sycamore, the fruits, which are these little balls, occur singly, whereas in the London plane tree, they occur in one or sets of two. If it's got two on it, if it's got fruit occurring in pairs, it's not an American sycamore. The great thing about American sycamores is they have optimal branching angles so that in the case of an ice storm, they are the tree that is least likely to experience damage. I mentioned the Populus genus in terms of pioneer species. We have a number of members of this genus in Michigan, including the eastern cottonwood, as well as the quaking aspen, that's Populus tremuloides, and the bigtooth aspen. I don't know the epithet for bigtooth aspen. I need to learn that one. I refer to the eastern cottonwood as the Jim Morrison of trees. It live fast and die young. They're tall. They go right up. So they're the, as I talked about, these are the pioneer species along with the birches that are colonizing new forest areas and providing that cover for the baby oaks, beeches and maples. A lot of people don't like cottonwood because of the cotton, the seed that it generates, but it's all biodegradable. I love cottonwoods. I used to garden for a house over near Mack Avenue here in Grosse Pointe Farms. And there was a cottonwood a couple doors down in the backyard, backed up against where I was working. And the thing about these trees, the leaves, the plane of the leaf it's very flat, and the stem is also flat, but it's at 90 degrees to the leaf plane. Okay, so what happens is the merest breeze comes through, it's going to catch some of that surface, either that's the stem or the leaf. It's going to catch that surface and it's going to move that leaf, and it creates this wonderful susurration that for me anyways, just transports me away from the urban context in which I am. And it's just like being back up north after everyone's left at the end of October. Quercus alba, there are two broad oak classifications. There are red oaks and white oaks. And this is sort of the name oak for the white oak classification. Quercus alba, quercus meaning oak, alba means white, obviously, I think it's obvious, perhaps not. Other white oak classification oaks include swamp white oak, Quercus bicolor, so-called because the bottom of the leaf is much lighter color than the top of the leaf, and it's kind of fuzzy. And Quercus macrocarpa, bur oak, which has the largest acorns of any oak in North America. Beautiful fall color with these plants, with the white oak especially. And if you only have space to plant one tree, plant an oak and plant a white oak. There's a fabulous book by Doug Tallamy called The Nature of Oaks. I wonder if I have it here. I do. How about that? I'm using it to support this book. Here, let's get the Nature of Oaks. Fabulous. He takes you through the entire calendar year of what oak tree in his yard, which is doing this. It does the same thing as any other oak out in the environment. What the services it provides in terms of the ecosystem services. It's a really great book. And Dr. Tallamy is such a great presenter, such an accessible, relatable author. I can't recommend his works highly enough. I have 3 or 4 books of his. They're just really fabulous. He's an entomologist and ecologist out of University of Delaware. Highly recommend anything he works on. So there you go. Plant a white oak. If you want a red oak, Quercus rubra, this is northern red oak. The other red oak classification oak species that I know of in Michigan would be pin oak, Quercus palustris, which is what I have in my front tree lawn, probably one of the fastest growing oaks native to Michigan. Also black oak, Quercus velutina, commonly found to the west of the state, specifically around Kalamazoo. Scarlet oak, there are a number of other oaks that are in this classification. These classifications are important because within these classifications, oaks tend to be rather promiscuous. That's actually a technical term. So what that means is that white oak species, so like Quercus alba, Quercus bicolor, Quercus macrocarpa, can easily hybridize between one another. There's actually a species called the bib oak, which is a hybrid. I don't know what its epithet is, but it's a spontaneous hybrid between, I think it's a white oak and a bur oak. Don't quote me on that. I'll look it up. Same goes for white oak species. Red oak species. So the way you can tell them apart, white oaks tend to have rounded lobes, whereas red oaks have pointed lobes. The other interesting thing about these plants, white oak acorns are not as bitter as red oak acorns. And the squirrels know this, and the trees know the squirrels know this. So that's why white oak acorns, meaning all the white oak acorn classification white oaks, germinate in the fall, and red oak acorns germinate in the spring, the next spring, because they know they don't have to hurry because they're not as tasty. They have more time. Sassafras albinum. This is our native sassafras related to spicebush. Like the Kentucky coffee tree and the honey locust, this is a dioecious plant, which means you have male and female plants. Also, like quaking aspen, it is a clonal plant, which means that off of a single root system, it will send up multiple stems. So even though you might have a small colony of sassafras trees growing, that may only be one organism. Actually, the largest terrestrial organism on the planet that we know of is a quaking aspen in Utah that covers acres of land with a single organism. It's a single root system that has multiple trunks coming up off of it. So if you have a small stand of sassafras, they may all be actually the same individual plant. So you might not get fruit because you need both genders to get fruit. This is a host plant for the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Ulmus americana, American elm. the victim of our second great arboricultural disaster in North America, the first being the American chestnut. Although, interestingly, recently they discovered a 50-year-old American chestnut, which is pretty amazing, actually near miraculous. American elm, beautiful vase-shaped, big tree. Unfortunately, all the native elms seem to be susceptible to the Dutch elm disease, which is I think it's a fungus, but it's transmitted by insects, sucking insects, leaf-sucking insects that pierce the leaves, and that's how they infect the tree. Introduce the fungus into the tree's vascular system. There are a number of lineages that seem to be more resistant to the pathogen. The Princeton elm and what is the other one? The Liberty elm are two lineages that seem to be fairly resistant to the pathogen. So, I mean, Detroit used to be known as the Paris of the Midwest because of its elm trees, which none of them are left really. Getting into smaller sort of understory trees, Amelanchier arborea is one of two serviceberry species native to Michigan, the other being Amelanchier laevis. This is a 4-season plant in terms of landscape value. Beautiful flowers early in the season, followed by delicious fruit that's quite ornamental. Delicious not only for the birds, but for us. It makes a great pie. It's fabulous in your oatmeal. Use it in your pancakes. Tastes like a cross between a raspberry and a blueberry. Beautiful, brilliant fall color and beautiful structure and bark in the winter. This is my favorite small tree. Cercis canadensis eastern redbud. Beautiful heart-shaped leaves going butter yellow in the fall, which is kind of interesting because the flowers are brilliantly pink, as I mentioned earlier, which means there's anthocyanins in this plant's tissues, at least in the spring, but those are definitely not expressed in the foliage in the fall. There is a cultivar called Forest Pansy Redbud that expresses red leaves all season long. I would not plant this plant because it cannot be utilized by the insects that would utilize the leaves, including, for example, our leafcutter bees, because of the presence of those anthocyanins in the foliar tissue. Stick with the species. Cornus florida, flowering dogwood. I mentioned that this and its relative Cornus alternifolia, which is the pagoda dogwood, these are both susceptible to anthracnose, a fungal disorder brought in on Kusa dogwoods from Asia. They don't have any resistance to it. The white flowering form seems to be a little more resistant. Keep your plant well ventilated, good air circulation around it to minimize risk of infection. In the case of dogwoods, anthracnose, once it goes systemic, is typically fatal. I have a dogwood that may have anthracnose, but I don't treat it because if I were to do so, that would mean that the tree could not be utilized by the organisms that rely on it, including spring and summer azure butterflies and anyone who might want to eat the fruit that it produces. The fruit's a favorite with a lot of our late season songbirds. Beautiful, beautiful color in the foliage in the fall. The dogwoods are great. We'll talk a little bit more about the shrubby dogwoods in a few minutes. Crataegus, hawthorn. Hawthorns, like those oak classifications, are pretty promiscuous. So sometimes it's difficult to be able to identify whether it's the specific species or the hybrid that may be, you may be looking at. They're in the rose family, like serviceberries. So they are prone to rust conditions. If you have rust conditions are fungal disorders characterized by two hosts, usually like a juniper and a member of the rose family. So if you have hawthorn, don't plant juniper nearby. If you have juniper, don't plant a crabapple or a hawthorn or what have you. I have a client over in Grosse Pointe Woods who had a bunch of sky pencil junipers in her yard, 7 of them, and she had a crabapple. Not right next to them, but pretty close. And all of those junipers eventually succumbed to rust. She spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to treat them. I think it was copper sulfide that she was using. It was a losing battle, but she wanted to fight it. And we've now done some different things to provide the privacy she wanted that she got from those junipers. And the crabapple is very happy. Cornus racemosa, gray dogwood. We have quite a few dogwood shrub species native to Michigan. So you're sure to find one that will work for you. And if you want to plant one shrub, if you're into birds, plant dogwood. Plant a dogwood shrub. Plant a bunch of dogwood shrubs if you can. Find the one that is appropriate for your context. Gray dogwood is pretty aggressive. So yes, Perry, I'm kind of busy right now, dear. So if you don't have a lot of space, you might not want to plant gray dogwood. The dogwoods are great in terms of landscape value because you have these really cool flowers and they're followed by these fruits. And look at these fruits. These, in this case, the gray dogwood, white fruits with a black eye, and these brilliantly scarlet stems, fruiting stems. And then you're getting this wonderful sort of bronzy burgundy foliage coming in for the fall. These are really great plants. There's silky dogwood, there's red twig dogwood, there are numerous dogwood shrub species native to Michigan that will provide great landscape value for you and for the wildlife. This is my favorite shrub, Hamamelis virginiana, common witch hazel. The reason I love this plant is it blooms late in the season, usually late October, early November. Although times are changing, time frames are changing for plants because of climate change. This plant has beautifully little yellow flowers that look like little crepe paper streamers. They're really tiny, but they're really a lot of them. It's quite floriferous. And the best way to site this plant is to put it so that the late fall westering sun late in the day is coming through it because it will light it on fire. It's just absolutely gorgeous. I love the foliage. It's really quite interesting. It has a nice texture, interesting structure. As I said, my favorite shrub. Ilex versalata, winterberry, or Michigan holly. Not great fall color, but what's great about this plant is the fruit. And you can see, this is in the summer, the fruit's developing. You can see how much fruit can be on this plant. It's a deciduous holly. The leaves drop on it. So once all these leaves drop, you just have these gorgeous fruits. Now, this is the species. There are a lot of cultivars out there. And I'll tell you, if you're trying to plant for wildlife as well as for beauty in your yard, go with the straight species. My friend Trish, who had a nursery up in Ortonville till she retired, when she and her husband moved into their house that they built, she landscaped around it with some cultivars of Michigan holly. She then discovered the species growing out in her property and started to propagate it. And she discovered on observation that at the end of the winter, the plants out in the wild would be stripped of fruit, whereas the plants near the house would not. The wildlife didn't want those. The fruit is not as valuable. When we take a plant and start manipulating its genetics for our benefit, we aren't necessarily maintaining its quality in terms of its ecological services. And there are a lot of different things that we're doing that may be counterproductive to the plant's function in the ecosystem. Lindera benzoin, or spice bush, related to the sassafras. Like sassafras, it is dioecious, so you need male and female plants. When this picture was taken, okay, so this is in the summer, and this picture, you can see the foliage is going this lovely yellow, a lot like the red bud. This picture was taken, I only had the one plant at the time, which is obviously a female. You can see this one berry she had this one year right here. I don't know how she had that berry because there's no spice bush around anywhere else at the time. A few years later, I was gifted a spice bush, which luckily turned out to be male, and we now have a lot of fruit on her, which we don't even get to take pictures of it because it gets harvested before it's even ripe. I need to put like a cheesecloth bag over it or something so we can get a really nice picture of how heavy fruiting it is when it's mature and very happy. This is a host plant for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. It also has the fruit, and the reason it's called spice bush, not surprisingly, being related to sassafras, if you scratch it, it has a very spicy scent, the wood. Benzoin was the source for benzoin, which was a tincture used in medicine. So this is how all these things relate. It's got very stringent qualities. Physocarpus apulifolius, or common 9-bark. This is not the best plant for a formal garden, but it has a lot of ecological services to offer. I've seen a lot of insects nectaring on the little balls of flowers, the sort of corms of flowers. Don't plant the red-leaved cultivars, summer wine, Diablo. These plants, because they are expressing those anthocyanins all season long, they are not available for the organisms that would otherwise feed on them. I mentioned Dr. Tallamy with the book about the oak tree. He's been a speaker at the Wildflower Association of Michigan a number of times. And I think the last time he was our keynote, he asked for questions at the end of his presentation, and someone asked him, what he saw as the biggest concerns in the landscape. And he mentioned specifically red-leaved cultivars of naturally green-leaved native plants. So I stay away from them now. They're one of the worst things that we can be doing. Rhus aromatica, fragrant sumac. Not a great picture, I'm sorry, for the fall at the lower left, but it does give you an idea of the color that it will get. The sumacs get great fall color, all of them. You'll probably see staghorn sumac. I don't know if I mentioned staghorn. I do, okay. Just great fall color. Fragrant sumac is quite fragrant. The tissues of the plant are quite fragrant in a good way. Viburnums are fragrant, but they're kind of malodorous, not aromatic. Great fall color. This is a pretty good sized plant in maturity, and it can sucker a bit and also layer. If it's got a branch that lays down, it'll spread. I have them in my front yard. They create a nice barrier during the summer. People can't see up onto my porch when I get my packages delivered, along with my chokeberry. So I really like this plant. I really enjoy it. And it is also, the sumacs are also dioecious, so you have male and female. Fragrant staghorn sumac, you'll see these a lot along the roadway. Not typically seen so much in cultivation because they're a bit leggy, not what people tend to be looking for in their gardens. Great plant if you have some property further out that you just want to have good stuff going on. As you can see, great fall color. The reason it's called staghorn sumac is because the branches have velvet on them. They're velvety, like a stag's horns before they rub the velvet off in the late season. The First Nations utilized the fruiting body for various things, including teas and the sort of thing. It's a beautiful plant, but you need some space for it to really look its best. Salix discolor pussy willow, not fabulous fall color on the willows. Of course, the attraction with pussy willow is the male catkins. These willows are really important ecological services, in terms of ecological services. They are third to oaks provide the most, support the most Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies for forage. Secondarily, the cherry species, and then third are the willows. And the cherries are just barely edging out the willows at about 450 or so. Across their range. So even though it might not be a beautiful plant in the fall in terms of its foliage, it does provide good ecological services during its growing season. I have a big one of these in my backyard. It's gotten kind of out of hand. I can't even reach the catkins anymore. I might try to lower it, but I like the structure of the plant. I like how the trunk looks on this, and I try to prune it nicely to keep that. It's a living sculpture. It becomes a focal point in my backyard. I love this plant. Staphylia trifolia, or bladdernut. This is this plant suffers from a really unfortunate common name, bladdernut. Try selling people on a plant whose common name includes words like spider, or snake, or wart, or weed. There's a delightful native fern that goes by the common name ebony spleenwort. It's so unfortunate, because it's just beautiful. Staphylia trifolia, the real attraction here is beautiful flowers in the spring. This is a classy shrub. It's a big plant. It's kind of leggy. I love it. The bark is fabulous. You can see the striated bark right here. It's just gorgeous. It's kind of reminiscent of striped maple, Acer pennsylvanicum. The trifolia in the epithet reflects the 3 leaves, or it's always 3 leaves together. So beautiful flowers. And what's really cool in the fall, the foliage isn't so hot, but the seed, the fruiting body, is this sort of papery husk, and the seed is contained inside. It's so ornamental. It's utterly fabulous. Speaking of vines, Parthenocissus quinquefolia, or Virginia creeper, we're seeing this right now going red. This is a plant that the deer and the bunnies cannot eat. It contains oxalic acid, which is a digestive and topical irritant for mammals. It's really important for the birds. The birds can handle the oxalic acid without a problem. I've seen it used really well as a ground cover. Great fall color with this plant. Some people don't like it because it can be aggressive. Well, the reason it's aggressive is vines evolved to grow at the margins of woodlands. And what we've done is we've exponentially increased its viable habitat, and the plant has responded to that. So that's why we see so much of it. I have it in my yard, and I just try to whack it back every once in a while because I love it. I think it's really cool. And finally, Toxicodendron radicans. Poison ivy, yes, poison ivy. Hang on. I'm sorry. Let's see if I have this book. I think I might. Nope, not there. Toxicodendron radicans. Poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac used to be in the Rhus genus with in the sumacs. They've now been broken out into their own genus, Toxicodendron. Toxico means poison, obviously. Dendron is Greek for wood. The plant isn't actually poisonous. It contains an allergen called usurial, which there's only one organism that has a problem with it, and that's us. And only 1/3 of us have a very, very severe reaction. 1/3 of us have a mild reaction, and 1/3 of us have no reaction at all. With repeated exposure, we can develop reactions like any other allergen, and it can go systemic. I'm sure some of you have had to deal with that. This is a really important habitat plant. It produces a white fruit, a waxy white berry that is extremely high in lipids, which means it's very high in fat content. And it's really important for our late season neotropical migrant birds, fueling up before they head back down to Central and South America. I go up to the Sleeping Bear Dunes area usually every fall, the end of October, when all the tourists are gone. And I go out on the dunes, and I love looking at what's going on out there because, you know, everything there is dwarfed because of the high wind coming off the lake. And as I was walking through, I noticed, very prone to the ground, a plant that had defoliated, but it had these white waxy berries. And that was the first time I ever saw the fruit for poison ivy. Now, poison ivy is interesting in a lot of different ways. It is related to pistachios, mangoes, and cashews. There's a reason you never see cashews other than just by themselves. They don't actually have a shell. You're not ever going to see them attached to the fruiting body because that contains the same allergen that poison ivy contains. I don't know about the presence of that chemical. I don't know if there's a parallel between people who are sensitive to poison ivy and whether they have allergies to any of its relatives, the mangoes, pistachios, or cashews. If you would like to learn more and understand better this plant, I strongly recommend Anita Sanchez's book, In Praise of Poison Ivy. It is utterly fabulous. She's again, like Dr. Tallamy, very accessible. She's a great writer. There is a lot about this plant to be appreciated. Not a plant that you would necessarily tolerate in your garden. No problem with that. And if you do find it in your garden and you have a problem with it, you should remove it using appropriate hygienic protocols. Never burn it. Never, ever, ever burn it because the usurial will go into the smoke, and if you inhale that, it will hurt your lungs really badly. But if you have a large property and it's somewhere out there, don't worry about it. Just leave it alone, because it does provide a lot of ecological services. During the pandemic, I attended a webinar about controlling invasive species with, I think, one of the DNR regions in the state. And people were asking about, how do you control violets? And then we don't control violets. Violets are supposed to be here. What do you do about poison ivy? We don't do anything about poison ivy. It's supposed to be here. It has a function. It has a value. It's not our enemy. It's not really, it's not out to hurt us. It just is what it is. Okay. Okay, we're done with the slideshow. Let's see. Chat.
If anyone has questions, they could put them in the chat.
Anybody have any questions?
And I'm
this
just
is not.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This is not intended to be an exhaustive list of plants. In fact, I went back through and I edited out a lot of stuff recently, because I had included a lot of near natives like catalpa and river birch, and trying to make it a little more concise. It's just sort of a sampling. There are hundreds of species of plants, woody plants native to Michigan. And there's going to be something that's going to work in your yard wherever you are. I have more than one client who said to me, "Oh, I have heavy clay, nothing will grow here." Well, no. Heavy clay is a naturally occurring phenomenon, at least it is here in Southeast Michigan. And there are plants that evolve to handle that. So there are things you can grow. You just need to be growing the right thing. If you have heavy clay, don't plant a white pine. They don't like that. They want to be sandy, fast draining soil out to the west of the state. There are things that will grow here and provide tremendous beauty for your garden, and at the same time, great ecological services for the environment. No questions?
Not seeing any. Thank you so much, Cheryl. This is so informative. I love gardening. I'm not great at it, but and we did inherit one of those red 9 barks in our backyard, but so good to know. That's why the animals leave it alone.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. I find with the red bud, I have, I mentioned the forest pansy red bud. I have a former client. She's no longer my client, because I just don't have time for that many gardening clients anymore. And she's no longer in the house that I used to work at for her. But at that house, which is maybe a quarter mile from my house in the same neighborhood I'm in, she has a forest pansy. There's a forest pansy redbud there. Mm-hmm. And in all the time that I worked there, I never saw any evidence of insect activity. I don't ever use the term insect damage unless it's Japanese beetles. But I don't use the term insect damage because the insects are supposed to be utilizing plants. If plants are the only things that can make their own food, that means all the rest of the stuff on the planet has to eat them. Okay, so plants are meant to be eaten. Plants have evolved the capacity to handle a significant amount of consumption and still thrive. A tree can give up 25 to 30% of its foliar tissue, and it's fine. That's part of its purpose, is to be eaten. And not just eaten, but utilized in other ways. So, for example, with my redbud, I see a lot of leafcutter bee activity. Leafcutter bees cut little round circles from the edges of leaves, and they use these to make their larval chambers when they lay their eggs. And leafcutter bees like soft leaves. They don't want hard oak leaves. They like soft leaves. And a lot of the plants in the pea family have these nice soft leaves. So like the redbud and my showy tick trefoil, Desmodium canadense, they love these plants for their little, I call them baby blankets. So the thing is, they have to chew the leaf to get the baby blanket. And if that leaf has those anthocyanins in it, it's toxic, and the bee isn't going to be able to utilize that plant. So whereas I see a lot of leafcutter bee activity on my redbud, because it's the species, I never saw any on that forest pansy redbud at my client's yard a quarter mile from my house, because it can't be utilized. Former
interesting.
acquaintance of mine used to say that forest pansy, red buds, and cockroaches will survive nuclear holocaust when the rest of us will be gone. And I think he may be right. So, you know, learning about the ramifications of your choices can be really helpful in what you do going forward.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's baby steps. It's baby steps.
Yeah, definitely. I've been a homeowner for about 10 years now, so I'm still learning, but and the soil is different at my house than it was when I lived a mile away, which is interesting.
Yep.
But yeah, it's a lot of trial and error.
I absolutely. And the thing that I have realized both as a gardener, and I've been in my house for 27 years, okay? I'm still learning. Okay, I'm still figuring stuff out. Let me tell you, I'm still figuring stuff out. And as a gardener and as an artist, I learn so much more from my mistakes than I do from my successes, because they really are embedded on my brain. Wow, that really didn't work, did it? Yeah, no, that was really a bad idea. Yeah, those things you don't forget easily. So
I agree.
And part of my agenda as an educator is, sharing my experience, which is just rife with mistakes, so that maybe you don't have to make them.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, pass it on, tell us, pass it on. Yep. So are we good, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you everybody for who attended. Thank you to the Friends of the Troy Public Library that help us fund programs like this. And Cheryl, thank you so much. Hopefully we can have you on again soon and learn more about our gardens.
That would be wonderful. I'd love to see you guys again.
Sounds good.
All right.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Good night. Stay safe and well.
Thank you.